Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Friday, ready to kick off a big weekend. Weather's beautiful out there again this afternoon, although we could use some rain if you caught Acadiana weather today earlier this morning. And you can always go back and look at that on my YouTube channel whenever you feel like it. But there are some chances for rain that'll start to come in as we head into next week. And then we're also looking at the possibility of some additional tropical development south of us down in the Caribbean coming up in a little over a week, and there have been some interesting model solutions, and I'm kind of waiting for the extended version of the GFS, even though it is showing some tropical weather moving up through the Caribbean islands and maybe a little closer to the eastern seaboard coming up into the early part of the week. There's also some other data that's just now starting to come in that may show kind of an interesting path of what a tropical system might have a chance of doing as we go into the following week, going into November. I've got some models that are showing one tropical system, and I've got a couple of other models that have got maybe two ripples of energy, one from a tropical wave that's actually coming off the African coast right now, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. First, outside, again, another beautiful day. There are a few more clouds that are starting to come in, so I'll go ahead and change that icon here real quick. We have a mix of sun and clouds and a temperature now at 82 degrees. Those winds are currently out of the southeast at 5, so with more of a southerly flow, those dew points are up. And earlier this morning we had the dense fog that was out there. As the temperatures and the dew points get closer together, your humidity starts to max out. Remember, as we look at our humidity at 56%, 56% is the amount of moisture that's available at that certain temperature. So our dew point right now is at 65, but as you get your dew point and your temperature closer together, let's say you got a temperature at 65 and your dew point is at 65, and your humidity is 100%. So the dew point gives you a little bit better idea of how much moisture is in the atmosphere, because when the temperatures are warm, it can hold a lot more water, and that's why your dew points are higher. So you might end up with a dew point of 50 when the temperature is at 50. That's still 100% humidity, but it's not nearly the amount of water that the atmosphere can hold when your temperatures are running in the 80s or 90s. So that's a little explanation about the dew point. But as it spreads apart, that's where you start to see your temperature or your humidity levels start to drop off, and it feels a lot more comfortable the farther away your temperature is from the dew point. And it gets a little too extreme, though, then you start to talk about those extreme dry conditions that we were having earlier this week, and that's why we were having some of the fire danger. Not only was it dry, but the air mass was very dry too. If it gets a little bit more humid, your fire danger does start to go down, even with a little bit less rain. But as you can see, the skies are pretty out there. We've got sunshine mixed in with the clouds, just a few pop-up clouds. Some of that is still leftover moisture from the fog that we had earlier today, but that caused some slowdowns, and I think we're probably going to see some slowdowns again as we go into early tomorrow morning. Looks like Sunday might be a little bit better, as we've got a front that's going to kind of push through here and bring us another round of some dry air. And you can kind of pick out where that front is right now on the national satellite imagery. It's right about in there, and low pressure is moving over southern Canada, and this is going to kind of push its way southeastward over the course of the weekend and allow some drier air to kind of wrap around the backside of that low and shove its way down into Louisiana. It's not going to be nearly as dry as what we were seeing earlier this week and even into last week, but it is going to be a noticeable change as we get into Sunday. And for our friends who are working in the offshore waters on some of the platforms out there, or maybe have to travel back and forth on some of the rigs or helicopters out there, pretty nice day. The winds, not too bad. If you're going to do some boating near shore waters, we're looking at 1 to 2 foot seas, maybe about 3 to 4 as you get in the far offshore waters, but fair weather cloudiness out there right now, just a few clouds kind of mixing in, the same as what we're seeing here on land. The upper levels, it's still pretty clear to see that you've got the upper level winds that are kind of traveling in that direction, and you notice that with some of the cirrus clouds that are right there. And then at the lower levels, you're generally got everything kind of pushing off toward the west. So you can kind of decipher nicely on these high resolution visible satellite images, the higher level clouds and the lower level clouds. And of course, earlier today, you see all that fog that was right there, that quickly dissipating as the sun came up today. Central America, we are watching this bit of a trough that's generating a large amount of thunderstorms, and I know this looks a little bit intriguing down here, but as of now, it's kind of a monsoonal low that's moving out of Colombia and has now moved into the extreme southern part of the Caribbean Sea, and it's going to hug the coast of Costa Rica and Panama here, but it appears this is going to go ahead and move off toward the west. And it is just a trough of low pressure. There's no low-level circulation or anything, at least at this time. But the thinking is that's going to continue to drift its way off toward the west into Central America. And, of course, if it gets over land, you're not going to have any development there. But it is something that we're going to watch just because we've had this flare-up of thunderstorms here in the last 6 to 10 hours. And we have seen these small troughs and these little systems kind of whip up into something fairly quickly, like what we saw with Nadine and Oscar. I don't think that's what's going to happen here, but it is something that we will definitely watch. As far as the Caribbean, things are relatively quiet. You got kind of what's left over of a front that's out here in the Atlantic, and that kind of extends its way down just north of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and then you've got kind of a ridge of high pressure coming in behind that. So we've got a tropical wave that's right there over the central part of the Caribbean Sea, and a little bit of a tropical wave coming into the far southern Windward Islands, and because of that ridge of high pressure, anything that's out there is basically just going to continue on a westward track moving across the Caribbean Sea. So we don't expect any issues there, at least over the next several days, but things could get a little more interesting farther down the road. And on the larger tropical Atlantic satellite, you can kind of see how that frontal boundary still lingers there across the eastern and western part of the Atlantic. You've got that tropical wave that's moving here now off of the African coast. And this is something that's a little interesting. There's a pretty good amount of moisture that has developed out in this area. We're going to watch this. It's going to take a fairly southerly track early on, but then some of the models do kind of turn it a little bit farther toward the north. And I know if you've been with me throughout the week, we've been talking about the possibility of some development out here in the western part of the Caribbean about 6 or 7 days from now. But a couple more of the models is kind of playing around with this that's out here in the eastern Atlantic and maybe putting another system over here north of the areas of Puerto Rico and into the northern Caribbean. So really some interesting model solutions that are coming down. But do keep in mind, these are still pretty far out, so it's something we're going to have to watch, and we're going to see some significant changes from model run to model run. And there's a little bit better look at the tropical wave that came off the African coast late last night, early this morning. It's now south of the Cape Verde Islands, and we'll just watch it over the. It's got several days before it's going to make its way toward the Windward Islands. So as far as the tropical weather outlook, the National Hurricane Center not indicating anything developing here in the next 7 days. But remember, with some of the computer models that we've been looking at here, we're talking about day 8 or 9. Now, the GFS has kind of sped things up a little bit, but the National Hurricane Center doesn't seem to be too interested in some of those subtle changes. And again, we don't really pay attention to any of those bigger changes that are there, especially when it comes to timing. But as other models start to come into more agreement, then you can have a better and clearer picture of the forecast. And I had lunch with some folks yesterday, and they're asking, how different forecasts go. And it's kind of like what I like to tell the kids when I go to the schools. You get some days, like particularly a day like today, where it's like a puzzle that has 10 pieces to it. A real easy puzzle, all the puzzle pieces fit together, and when you have it done, you have a very clear picture of what your puzzle is supposed to be. And then you get other kinds of weather scenarios where it's more like a 1,000-piece puzzle, but none of the pieces really fit together. So you kind of jam them in there the best you can, and you get kind of a picture of what's there, and you just kind of have to take your best guess at the end. So that's kind of how your easy forecast and your difficult forecast go. It's kind of like doing an easy puzzle or a very difficult puzzle. But I will say that beyond 7 days, the Global Tropics Hazard Outlook, which came out on Tuesday, shows the indication of some development there over the Western Caribbean, even taking that into week 3, which would be November 6th through the 12th. We will get an update on this on Tuesday, and I'll bring you the next update on Wednesday because it does come down a little bit later later than when we do these live Let's Talk Tropics here around the midday time period. But that is an area that tends to see better development during the month of November. Really, the Atlantic does start to shut down quite a bit, but the Caribbean and the far western Atlantic are still your most likely areas where we could see some development. And that's what we'll kind of go over when we go look at the extended models here. So first, we'll just go with the GFS. And the GFS, as you've seen all week, has indicated low pressure developing here and then kind of sliding northward. Now, this particular model is kind of curving it back off to the east a little bit and then kind of coming back into the western Atlantic. And as I talk to you here, I'm still waiting for the last several frames of the GFS model to come down, and I'm going to try to get that updated before we get a little farther down the road. But this is a little bit different than what we've seen over the prior days, but it's still in pretty good agreement from our previous models that low pressure is going to develop over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. Whether it goes this way, whether it goes this way, or this way is still very uncertain. And again, you're going to see more consistency in model run to model run. And I will say, you see that little low right there? That also kind of developing. So the GFS might be trying to work with this tropical wave that's going to be coming in from the east. So as this low is developing down to the south, you get another little ripple that starts to develop there. That is a possibility. We did have two fairly close systems with Nadine and Oscar earlier in the week, so the possibility of this happening, yeah, it's a possibility. But like I said, we're still going out about 7 or 8 days there. But I will say the Euro seems to be coming on board a little bit more now that it can start to see that far into the forecast going days 7 through 10. And you will see there at the very end, you'll get a little bit of a low pressure area kind of developing there over the western part of the Caribbean and then kind of sliding around Jamaica, eastern Cuba, and just kind of meandering around. So as you go into days 8 and 9 on the Euro model, you get some development. And then by day 10, you're seeing a movement more toward Cuba. But remember, by day 10, the GFS model actually has something way up here. So the timing is a bigger difference between the two big global models that we like to use, the GFS and the Euro. The Canadian is still used as a global model for tropical weather, although it's not trusted quite as much. But I will say that the Canadian and the Icon have actually done pretty well in the long range of predicting tropical systems over the course of the hurricane season this year. They haven't been real good on the short-term forecast when you're really kind of splitting hairs of where a tropical system is going to make landfall 2 or 3 days out. But the Canadian and the Icon has been really good about showing something developing about 7, 8, 9, 10 days out, and then actually seeing something develop in that particular area. So a couple of things to point out. It is indicating a bit of a low pressure area. This model's backed off a bit from the earlier model, but there's a little low that's kind of developing there. And then it's also trying to play with something here. So we might be looking at low pressure from maybe the Central American gyre or possibly the tropical wave that's currently over the eastern part of the Windward Islands. But it also might be playing with this other tropical wave that's out near Africa and kind of lifting its way there. But the Canadian model isn't showing two ripples of energy quite as decisive as what the Euro and the GFS was. And also the earlier version of the Canadian model also had two defined areas of low pressure. So if you were with me yesterday and we talked about how you can go back from different models, because I do have the links of all these models are down below. So you can go to Tropical Tidbits and you can pick all of these models, but you can also at the bottom, there's a previous model button. So you can stop it on any frame that looks interesting, and then you can go back and you can continue to go back and back and back, and it'll show you the different solutions for that individual hour. And the same goes with the Icon. So again, play with those models over the weekend. They're a lot of fun to go through, and then you can kind of put your own weather forecast together, and you might see some things, in between these shows that look a little bit interesting too. But the Icon model is, again, showing more of a broad area of low pressure, but look over there. There's another little trough there. So again, nothing real certain on here. It's just kind of showing that it's going to try over the western part of the Caribbean. But that little wave that's maybe over north of Puerto Rico, that tropical wave that's coming off the African coast. That's something that's a little bit new in our extended models that are right now. So what I'm going to do here, if you just hang with me for just a second, I'm going to go ahead and update the GFS model here because it looks like it's just about finished. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the models going from day 10 and then beyond that. So day 10 and farther out. So remember when we showed you the GFS, and let me just go back to it real quick here. I got that updated. So let me go back to the GFS, and you can see how that low kind of comes out of the Caribbean and then works its way northward up through the Caribbean islands, kind of spins its way eastward a little bit, and then kind of curves back into the western part of the Atlantic Ocean. So that goes out to day 10. So now we're going to look at this fresh together here. I haven't seen this. So this is watching that low from day 10, and then look what it does. It just kind of meanders around there and then finally gets caught in a larger trough. One of the things that I find interesting about this is that trough that would hopefully push this away from the U.S. coast. The earlier GFS model was really showing a push of some very deep and cold air here across the northern Gulf Coast. And I looked at some of the earlier temperature models that were on there, and it was showing some low 30s over the Arclitex and maybe the first frost or freeze for parts of the Arclitex. Didn't look like it was coming quite this far south, but I will say this extended model that I'm looking at here, it's not quite as defined, but there's still a pretty good dip in the jet stream, that blast of cold air kind of coming in. It's not as pronounced as the earlier model run, but that takes you out to about November the 10th or the 11th. So could we be seeing some almost winter-like temperatures coming up in a couple, 3 weeks? That could be some nice changes. Maybe get you more into the holiday spirit. As I know we're, just about a month away from Thanksgiving, if you can believe that. So we are getting closer to the end of the hurricane season, but wanted to kind of bring you up to date. I haven't shown you this one in a long time. This is the El Nino oscillation. These are the models that we look at. And remember at the beginning of the hurricane season when some of these predictions were coming out talking about 20 to 23 named storms. Well, a lot of it, they were thinking that La Nina was going to kick in a little earlier in the hurricane season. And if you didn't know, when you're in a La Nina pattern, you get lighter trade winds and lighter wind shear. So you can sometimes get larger numbers of tropical systems over the Atlantic Ocean when you're in a La Nina pattern. But the La Nina pattern is just now starting to kick in, and it looks like we're going to stay with La Nina here. That's the blue shade. These are the predictions as you go September, October, November, and then the next one there is October, November, December, and then you're starting to get here into the middle part of the winter here, where it's still looking at La Nina. And I'll tell you, with La Nina patterns, your jet stream kind of runs a little bit farther to the north from west to east. So for us here in Louisiana, unfortunately, it means usually a drier winter, and we've been pretty dry here over the last month, so we could really use some rain. But for those of you who are more cold weather fans, La Nina also tends to keep our temperatures slightly above normal. But I will say that this particular La Nina, and this is looking at the La Nina models where we are right now, which is right about there. And this is where we're predicted to go going into next summer. That's June, July, August there, going into next summer. And you can see that this is the line. This is what we call the neutral zone. So we're still kind of in the neutral zone and then maybe getting down into a La Nina here going through the winter. But then you start to see those trends going back up. So prior to next year's hurricane season, we might be in that neutral zone once again. And that can kind of make your hurricane predictions for an entire season a little bit more difficult. If you have a very pronounced El Nino or a very pronounced La Nina, that's when you start to get these big, robust hurricane forecasts like what we saw earlier. Or if it's El Nino, that tends to kind of drop the number of hurricanes and tropical storms. So if we were seeing a very strong El Nino coming, you would see those numbers come down. But looking at the next several months in some of these computer models, it does appear that what we're going to be seeing is probably just a very, very weak La Nina for the next several months, and then maybe starting to transition more to an El Nino coming up. So before I let you go, since we don't have any big stuff out on the Atlantic side, a lot of times when the Atlantic quiets down, the Pacific tends to get a little busier. You can see we've got Hurricane Kristy that's out there in the middle part of the Atlantic. It is a major hurricane with winds at 125 miles per hour. It's come down a little bit. But it is expected to continue to kind of drift off toward the northwest. It's going to encounter some much colder waters, and we do expect this to go ahead and dissipate over the next several days. Probably by the weekend, we won't be able to talk about Kristy anymore as it moves away. So we've just got that on the Pacific side, just in case you were interested, that we do have some tropical activity in the northern hemisphere around the Americas right now, but everything seems to be on the Pacific side. Well, hopefully I explained everything. And really, I encourage everybody to, go down to the links below, go to some of these websites, play around. What I love about being able to do this on YouTube is all of these graphics are free and available to the public. So everything that I'm using here to build my forecast, you can look at all the same things and maybe follow along or try to produce your own forecast and get a better handle on how the atmospheric conditions work, how tropical weather works, and even how daily weather works. You can grab all of these graphics anytime you want. Also wanted to remind you to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also turn on those notifications. But starting on November the 4th, which is a week from Monday, my weather forecasts are going to be on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. You'll be able to hear the forecast during their morning shows and a midday, and then also the afternoon drive. I'll be providing them with daily weather forecasts Monday through Friday there. And then if there's any severe weather too, I'll probably connect with all of them over at Acadiana Broadcasting Company to give them the updates there. But I'm still going to be on YouTube for Let's Talk Tropics, at least through the rest of the month of November, and then also the daily weather forecast on Acadiana Weather Today. In between all of that, you can, of course, follow my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. Well, I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Thanks for joining me for lunch today, and I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.